Hey, this is Sam Black with my third match with this Bant cube deck. I've lost the roll, and I have a pretty good hand. I can play Arbor Elf on the first turn, and then either Smuggler's Copter or Porcelain Legionnaire or suspend Riftwing Cloudskate. I think that when I have an Accelerator on turn 1, I generally prefer not to play a 2-drop over suspending Riftwing Cloudskate, because it's a turn earlier that I'll be able to just hard cast the Cloudskate, but I can make that decision once I have some more information. It's a clear keep. I also have all my colors and just the ideal 3-land 4-spell split. Draw another island, which makes the plan of casting Riftwing Cloudskate even easier. My opponent plays Rofellos, which is extremely scary. And I'm going to attack with Arbor Elf and play Smuggler's Copter. There's very little chance that my opponent is going to block or attack with Rofellos. It's going to be a very valuable mana producer that my opponent will almost certainly use to do something gross this turn. Opponent plays Sakura Tribe Elder and Lotus Cobra, so I get off kind of easy here. And I draw a Cryptic Command. So I'm going to crew the Smuggler's Copter rather than playing Porcelain Legionnaire first, because I can potentially draw and do a different creature I'd rather play this way. Attack with Smuggler's Copter, discard Riftwing Cloudskate. I think it's close as to whether I'd rather discard Riftwing Cloudskate or Mother of Runes, but decided to go with the Cloudskate. And then, having done that, I decided to play Mother of Runes and Porcelain Legionnaire. So I'm delaying my ability to cast Cryptic by a turn by getting the white mana in play instead of playing another island. But in exchange, I get Mother of Runes active, or, well, around doing stuff, active soon. My opponent sacrifices Sakura Tribe Elder to get a land and trigger Lotus Cobra. More Lotus Cobra triggers and casts Terastodon. So my opponent has some options here on what to do with it, and they go for killing 3 of my things rather than killing any of their lands to get blockers. So that kind of gives me a path. Now my opponent has only 1 large creature, and I have 4 good attackers, and I have Mother of Runes to save the one that gets blocked, and my opponent's only at 16. I think that my opponent really should have Terastodoned one of their forests and left me with one of my lands, but that obviously depends on what else they have. Their follow-up is Caryatid, and I just play a land, make my attack. My opponent makes the obvious block. I save my creature. My opponent falls to 7. And now my opponent doesn't have a follow-up. So I really think that not making an elephant for themselves was a big mistake here. I draw a counterspell, which is actually perfect. Play island, and now I can make the same attack, and I have counterspell up. My opponent's gonna double block an elephant and fall to 1 here. I save 1 creature and trade the other one for my opponent's 2 creatures. And I basically can't lose at this point, because I have counterspell for whatever my opponent plays, Cryptic Command for something the following turn, but that's not really going to matter because my opponent's at 1 with only green creatures, and I can use Mother of Runes to give something protection to get through. So winning this Terastodon game, I think, because of how my opponent used Terastodon. I think that this is a really bad matchup for me in general. The fair creature decks do not match up well against the green ramp decks, where I'm not creating a fast enough clock to stop my opponent from doing stuff like casting Terastodon, but I do have ways of getting lucky. I have a few counter spells. If they happen to have only 1 big thing like this game, I can counter it, or apparently sometimes just beat it. I also have a good number of flyers, and Sword of Body and Mind is incredible here, so Anyway, that's game 1. Game 2, I am going to be on the draw, and this hand is really bad. I hope I'm mulligan it. Yeah. And this hand is not good, especially on the draw, but I have a scry plus another scry in the Temple of Mystery, plus I definitely don't want to go to 5, so, and I have all my colors at least. So play Temple, scry, my opponent strip mines my Temple, which is a pretty big problem, and then plays Rofellos. So not only am I set back, but my opponent's way ahead on mana. I'm going to play Mother of Runes, and my opponent has one of the best things that you can possibly play here in Freyalise, putting them really far ahead on mana, and I don't have any way to threaten Freyalise, so it's threatening to ultimate pretty soon and draw a bunch of cards, which is kind of the perfect thing once you have Rofellos and a bunch of other mana elves. And I don't have a play here, and I can't Oblivion Ring anything other than Freyalise because Freyalise's minus can kill it. And follows it up with a Courser, which lets them play a land off the top, functionally drawing even more cards and getting even more mana, and then Harmonize. So I'm ready to call this game completely unrecoverable at this point. I can Oblivion Ring the Freyalise to stop my opponent from just drawing 6 on their next turn, which is necessary to having the slightest bit of a chance. But I still have no blue mana, and I have 3 blue cards in my hand, and my opponent has more mana than I want to count, and Courser in play, and a lot of cards that they just drew off Harmonize. So my opponent's going to cast Tooth and Nail, and that is definitely going to be good enough for a win. It gets Terastodon, which can blow up my Oblivion Ring and get back Freyalise, and also Dromoka, which turns off any ability to try to attack. Not that that's going to be possible through all these creatures in the Terastodon anyway. So, lost that game very badly. And then, not really feeling optimistic about this match, but I am on the play. And my hand is more or less completely perfect. I have turn 1 Porcelain Legionnaire, turn 2 Sword of Fire and Ice, because of drawing both of my Moxes. And I have Oblivion Ring to push through the Porcelain Legionnaire if it comes to it. So I'm just going to play everything, not pay life for the Porcelain Legionnaire, because no real reason not to do it that way. My opponent plays Bird. I'm just going to attack and then play the sword. I could play the Oblivion Ring, but I think that it is not worth it when I have sword to answer the bird, and I want to be sure that I can equip the sword next turn, and if I draw another land, I can equip the sword and potentially Oblivion Ring my opponent's play that they use the bird to make, and then finish off the bird with the sword. So as it turns out, my opponent doesn't have another land and just plays Lotus Cobra, and now I can equip the Porcelain Legionnaire and force a chump block, put my opponent back down to 2 mana. My opponent has Tree Speaker and no other land, so now my opponent's solidly under the Abyss, and I have a Cryptic Command, so that's more or less the hard lock, and then I also have Sword of Body and Mind, which I can play and equip when I draw 1 more land. So, just going to Abyss my opponent here and pass with Cryptic Command up. And my opponent is going to think about their play and then play Courser, which I'm just going to counter because I want to try to draw into a land, and I don't want the blocker. I want to be able to finish off this bird and start ending the game. I don't draw an untapped land, so I just play Edric, which is going to let me draw 2 more cards and kill the bird. Well, I was going to kill the bird anyway, and draw 1 of the cards anyway, but gives me an extra card to try to find a land to be able to play the Copter. I draw 2 tapped lands, so I'm just going to play one of those. And yeah, my opponent is very dead. So I do think this was a really bad matchup, but my opponent got extremely unlucky, and I got extremely lucky in Game 3 after what I believe was their misplay let me win Game 1. So managed to 3-0 this draft with a deck that I think was solid, but not in any way the kind of deck where I felt confident after the draft that it was going to 3-0. I think that this is a pretty normal version of a pretty normal archetype, you can usually get a deck that looks something like this. It's just a common place for me to go when I end up with a sort of Body and Mind or Fire and Ice. Usually picks 2 through 5 in pack 1, and if I start any of the Bant colors and then get that sword, there's a good chance that more or less exactly this kind of deck is what I'll try to draft, where I have a bit of interaction, some mana creatures, some other just creatures, and a few pieces of equipment, and I'm just trying to play, I guess, a Protect the Queen strategy, where I just get a creature out, ideally give it a sword, counter my opponent's big play, and end the game with that creature. And I like this strategy because it is pretty consistent in terms of how it plays out. You never have the spots where you draw all ramp and nothing to do with it, because you don't have as much ramp as something like my opponent's deck. You don't have the spots where you draw all big stuff and not enough mana to cast it because you're not playing the big stuff. And you don't have the spots where your opponent does something that your plan can't interact with at all, because you have access to white removal that's extremely versatile, and green artifact and enchantment destruction, and counter spells in blue. So you can generally have access to cards that are going to line up well against whatever your opponent's doing. Also, it's extremely easy for this deck to have a really large number of extremely hateful cards against any red aggressive deck, where you'll just end up incidentally having some equipment that gains life, like Umezawa's Jitte or Batterskull, or any combination of cards like Kitchen Finks and Thragtusk and whatever other random life gain creatures you might find. I had Timely Reinforcements in my sideboard this deck, I believe. Random Baneslayer Angel type cards, Dragonlord Dromoka. So it's just a spot where I feel like you have a lot of versatility in terms of how you sideboard, the ability to draft a lot of on-plan interactive cards with things like Reclamation Sage and Reflector Mage and Trigon Predator, and Scavenging Ooze is a card that you can board in some spots where it's interactive. So it's one of the more reliable ways to play Fair Magic in Cube, which I've mentioned a few times now, I think is my preferred approach to this cube. Don't try to do the busted stuff that sometimes requires a lot of things to go right. Just draft the decks where there are a lot of interchangeable pieces and you have enough disruption for what your opponent does and a way to consistently have a normal plan to try to win the game. So that was a successful cube draft.